Hi, thanks for tuning in today. Today I want to share some thoughts with you about FHA Scrivener. I'd made a video about him before, but I want to just go a little bit deeper than I did in that video and share a few more thoughts regarding FHA Scrivener and particularly his relationship to the King James Version only movement, the Textus Receptus, and the Byzantine text. So stay with me and we'll jump into this. So one of the things that I didn't appreciate about Scrivener when I first made that video was one of the important things, one of the important works that he had done, and it's called a supplement to the King James Version or a supplement to the Authorized Version, which sounds like it would be sort of a guide, maybe a helpful guide to the King James Version. FHA Scrivener was an expert on the Authorized Version. He had done quite a bit of work to try to compare the various editions of the King James Version. By Scrivener's day, there were so many different minor variations between the King James Version. He worked hard to try to bring it together and get to the original King James Version, as it were. And he produced his King James Version paragraph Bible. So he was a foremost expert on the King James Version. He was also an expert in his day on textual criticism, and he was very aware of particular editions of the Textus Receptus. So he was a highly qualified man, and he had written a book called a supplement, something like this, a supplement to the Authorized Version. And the title of that book makes you think that Scrivener was maybe adding something to the discussion on the King James Version, maybe something that would be helpful, hints and some maybe some little clues as to how to interpret the King James Version or something like that. But what it really was, I think the best way to describe that book is really an apology, not an apology like you're saying I'm sorry, but a defense of the idea that there needed to be a revision of the King James Version. And I didn't realize quite how vocal Scrivener was in the need for a revision of the King James Version. Now, anybody who's watched this channel will know a couple things about me. One, I like the King James Version. I love the King James Version. I read from the King James Version. I think it's beautiful and wonderful. At the same time, I'm also not King James only. So people will hop onto my channel and they'll watch some of my videos, see some of the stuff on the Byzantine text, or maybe some stuff on the Textus Receptus, and maybe assume things about my position that just aren't true. They watch more of my videos and then they unsubscribe. And that's fine, no problem there. But my position is that the King James Version is a wonderful translation. It's a beautiful translation. And what I found interesting was how strongly Scrivener felt like the King James Version needed a revision. Now, what's interesting about that is his name is often associated with some of the King James only movement. And you could probably hear Benjamin in the background there. I apologize about that. But he's associated with the King James only movement somewhat because those who are oftentimes some who are King James Version onlyists will like to appeal to the Textus Receptus that was edited under his hand. But what I pointed out in the previous video that I made on Scrivener is those do not reflect his own textual decisions. He had been involved in the Revised Version, which this book, I think, was really a forerunner, making a defense for why they need a Revised Version, this supplement to the Authorized Version that he wrote. And in the process of doing the Revised Version, it fell to his task to try to compare where the Authorized Version underlying Greek text differed from the Greek text that was underneath the Revised Version. But what he identified in his book, the supplement to the Authorized Version, and again, I'm not sharing my opinions here. I just want you to know Scrivener's position, because I think it's historically interesting. Because what's happened to Scrivener is people have tried to claim him on almost every different side. He was a brilliant scholar, and you want to be able to agree with Scrivener to a certain extent, or have Scrivener agreeing with you, because brilliant guy. I mean, his knowledge of the manuscripts, his knowledge of the resources of his day, his learning, almost unparalleled in in his day, and also even in modern times. Just brilliant person, and it's nice to have brilliant people agreeing with you, I guess. But I want to set the record straight, because he's being claimed by multiple sides. And as far as the King James Version was concerned, he didn't think it just needed a revision because the language had become outdated. He believed that there were three kinds of errors in the King James Version. He believed there were errors of criticism, he believed there were errors of interpretation, and he believed there were errors of expression. And he spends a very good bit of the book, supplement to the Authorized Version, explaining his methodology, his views. And he's writing, I believe, in around the 1840s, and his views would maybe shift a little bit here and there, but I think it's pretty representative of who the man was. And again, people on the critical text side, like Daniel Wallace, have sort of tried to pull Scrivener in one direction, and some people on the other side have tried to pull him on the other direction. And I just want to kind of set the record straight about what the man's own views were. So he did think that there were actual errors in the King James Version Bible. He went through particularly the book of Matthew, the last half of the book, or maybe it's not half, but the last major section of the book is going through the book of Matthew and pointing out everything that he thought that the King James Version got wrong about the book of Matthew. Now, it's tedious reading. One, because of his erudition, that is a brilliant, learned man, and he's not writing on a lay level, but also because what he tries to expose as errors, sometimes they're so trifling, so tiny, so minuscule that it's almost hard to read. So to give you a sense about his views on textual criticism, there's one part of the book, and he refers to so many places in the New Testament have been rashly mangled by German editors. He was concerned about in principle, he had no problem with there being errors in the Textus Receptus, but what he was concerned about was how rashly and how quickly and on such slender evidence, especially German critics, he would probably be referring to people like Griesbach, were changing the nature of the New Testament. There's another place, I think it's in this work, but there's another place where Scrivener identifies the fact that he believed that the editors of the Textus Receptus had some degree of providential guidance, because they followed manuscripts that he felt like were representative of the main manuscripts that had been read and used throughout church history. And they had opportunity to follow manuscripts like Codex Bezae, but they did not. And he thought that was God's providential guidance. And there's another quote here. Those who favor the Textus Receptus will maybe appreciate this quote. He said, "I would adhere as much as possible to the text of the editions of Stevens, Beza, and the Elzevirs, not indeed because it is the received text, as Lockman so unfairly insinuates, but because I believe it to bear on the whole a close resemblance to the best manuscripts which have been used by the Greek Church from the earliest ages. The schemes both of Griesbach and of Lockman I feel bound to reject, since their direct tendency is to overthrow the testimony of the vast majority of our critical authorities on grounds too precarious to admit of satisfactory defense." So he proposed going about it a little bit different, and he did put value on the Byzantine manuscripts. And So there were a number of places where Scrivener would disagree with the received text, and he goes through those in the book of Matthew. On the whole, he has a great reluctance to go against the vast majority of Greek witnesses. Now, there are occasions where he will, and this has led some people on the critical text camp, namely Daniel Wallace, to try to kind of pull him closer to maybe a critical text position. But on the whole, I think that if you look at his work, you can see that he had this great affinity for the bulk of Greek witnesses. That's not to say that he would agree, that he would take, like a text like the majority text and agree with every jot and tittle of it. He did appreciate the value of ancient witnesses, and he also appreciated the value of internal. He put weight on internal evidence, so that when you had Gospels like Matthew and Mark, Luke, and you'd have parallel passages, he could see where maybe a cross-contamination could happen. So he doesn't fit neatly in any of our categories, but the one category, if anybody who would take a King James only position, and I'm not attacking King James onlyists, that's not the purpose of this video. My purpose in this video is just to give you accurate information about a man who's often misunderstood. He is not a friend of King James onlyism. His whole book, a supplement to the Authorized Version, the whole purpose of that book is to expose what he regarded as shortcomings and failings of the King James Version. So if you're a King James only advocate and you're looking for an ally, Scrivener's not your guy. What's interesting is that he was highly respected by people like Dean Burgon, who is also often cited in the King James only movement. But the truth is, Scrivener and even I think Dean Burgon would have places that they would disagree with the King James Version. Now, my purpose, again, in this video is not to attack the King James Version. I love the King James Version. It's not to attack Scrivener. It's just to set the record straight. I think there's been so many people who have tried to claim this man that it's important to realize who he was. He was a man who put great value on the Byzantine text, but he did not think it was an infallible guide. He did think that sometimes the Byzantine text could get it wrong. But in the main, he was much more conservative than people like Westcott and Hort, Griesbach, Lockman, and as the quote that I showed you, he put great value in the witnesses that undergirded the Textus Receptus. So in that regard, I would say that Scrivener is a complicated man and doesn't fit neatly in some of our categories today. So I just wanted to kind of talk this through and set the record right. And so I hope you have a good evening tonight.